Hey guys, Chris from Average Eskate Reviews here, and today in this video we're going to be taking a look at the Ownboard Bamboo with the all-terrain wheels that are airless versus the Evolve GTR Bamboo with the all-terrain wheels 6-inch that are aired or have inner tubes. This is essentially going to be a comparison video to highlight the differences between these boards, not to show you which one is best, because essentially one of these boards costs almost half the price of the other. So it's pretty obvious which is going to be the better one, but what I wanted to do was show you the real differences between these boards to highlight which one will be the better one for you. Just because a lot of the times the more expensive one does seem to be the more desirable one, that might not be the case here. So let's highlight the differences and show you which one of these boards might work best for yourself. Before we jump into the video, make sure that you thumbs up and also subscribe so you can stay up to date with all of the videos that we post. Make sure the notification bell is turned on so you are notified when I post a new video, and also make sure that you follow us on the Instagram page so you can see what we get up to behind the scenes, what we do when we're riding our boards, where we ride, and also sharing a little bit of insight into upcoming boards that we may be featuring on the YouTube channel. But without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, as always, splitting the video up into categories. The first one is going to be the most important thing for me on a board, which is the speed. Now, with all-terrain wheels, we all know that they're not the quickest wheels that you can get for an electric skateboard, but they have a lot of benefits, and it's why we're such big fans of them. When we look at both of these wheels, the Ownboard has essentially wheels that are classified as 6-inch, but in theory are actually 6.5 inches. When we look at the wheels featured on the Evolve Bamboo GTR, those wheels are 6 inches. So the Ownboard does have a slightly bigger diameter wheel than the GTR Bamboo. Worth mentioning straight off the top. But the speeds that we're able to get out of these two boards are very, very similar. Essentially, both of these boards achieve speeds of roughly 24 to 26 miles an hour. Having both of these boards racing each other side by side, neither board seems to really kind of creep ahead of the other. But one thing I will mention is that although the top speed is the same, the acceleration is not. The GTR, especially in GTR mode, is incredibly savage. Evolve have managed to find a very good balance between top speed and also acceleration with all of the different wheel setups and gear setups that they offer, that when you throw it into the highest mode, which is GTR mode, it is very, very aggressive and it's very torquey. It's exactly what you would expect from a board at this price point. When we look at Ownboard's acceleration, it's definitely important to mention that this isn't using the latest updates to the ESC that we know that are available to date, but with what we have now, the acceleration is much, much more sluggish than the Evolve GTR Bamboo. It's worth mentioning that once the ESC and remote are updated and you're using the newer version of the remote as well, there is a slight increase in the acceleration and also a slight increase in the responsiveness of the braking, but it's still going to be essentially falling a little bit short of what you can expect to find in the GTR Bamboo. Quick side note, if you can hear little meows in the background, I've got kittens, 2 of them running around my living room right now, so just bear that in mind if you wondered what the hell that sound was. We're going to be trying something a bit different with this review. I'm going to be trying to do it in a point system or format, so anytime one manufacturer gets something right over another, we'll give them a point, we'll tally up at the end and see where we stand. Now, as we're looking at this from a points perspective, with the category of speed, because it was essentially the same top speed on both of these boards, quite surprisingly, we have to give each of these companies 1 point. So right now, Evolve 1, Ownboard 1. Now, when we look at the points of acceleration, Evolve definitely edge out Ownboard in terms of the torque and the general performance and the savage acceleration that you can get out of these boards. And bear in mind, this excludes tweaking the board's performance in the app where you can actually make the acceleration more aggressive. So on the notion of acceleration, we definitely have to award a point here to Evolve. That leaves us 2-1 to Evolve versus Ownboard. Now, when we look at range, this is going to be a big one for a lot of people. Starting off with Ownboard, with the AT airless wheels, we are able to achieve a range of somewhere between 12 and 17 miles. It does depend how aggressive you're riding, your build, weather conditions, terrain. All of these things play a massive factor into what range you're able to get. So it's very subjective based on the conditions and the rider themselves. When we look at the GTR Bamboo, I'm able to get a pretty consistent range of somewhere between 12 and 14 miles in GTR mode with the 6-inch aired inner tube tires. Now, one thing I have to mention is clearly the Ownboard does get a little bit more range here, but it's important to mention that because these are airless wheels, the resistance and essentially grip and traction they have on the ground is much less. Very similar to the case of looking at a street wheel versus a cloud wheel. It has essentially less rolling resistance, and that's what's responsible for being able to give it a little bit more range. I also have to mention that although the Ownboard is able to get more range in the AT version that we're looking at in this case, we're also riding much, much less aggressively with the Ownboard, purely because the wheels slide a lot more than the aired inner tubed tires that you get from Evolve and their AT wheels versus what you get from Ownboard. So in the GTR Bamboo, I'd be typically riding very aggressively in the Ownboard with its AT wheels that don't have any tubes, I'd be riding a lot more conservatively just because I know that I can't push this board as far as I can. So it's a bit of a catch-22 where there's a reason for one performing better in terms of range than another because of the aggressiveness of the ride. Of course, if I tone down my riding on the GTR, I could definitely hit a very similar range to what the Ownboard is capable of doing. So I think it's only fair to award a point each here, just because the aggressiveness of your ride can be very important for some people like me, but also riding conservatively is something that I feel a lot more electric skateboard riders are going to be doing, and that obviously will have an impact on how much range you're able to get out of the GTR with its particular setup. So I think I'm going to have to say that it's going to be a point each in this area. And something else worth mentioning is anything that I relate to in terms of the GTR's performance in terms of range is only in GTR mode, because that is the only mode that we ride that board in, which is the quickest and most aggressive mode that the GTR boards have. So of course, if we were to compare the acceleration to Ownboard, I'd probably say that it would be much, much similar to switching the GTR into Pro mode. Now, switching the GTR into Pro mode will have a very big difference in terms of how much range you're able to get out of the board, which is of course worth mentioning. If we were to switch the GTR into Pro mode, the range that you'd be able to get out of the board would be a lot more than the 12 to 14 miles, which I mentioned earlier on, which is based on having the board in GTR mode. So that's why I'm awarding a point each to both of the manufacturers in this category over here, because if you switched up the GTR's mode to essentially best reflect or best mimic the Ownboard, you would get a bigger range with the GTR board. Hence why we'll give them each a point in this category. So please bear that in mind, because with the Ownboard you essentially have a slow, medium and fast option for riding preferences, but on the GTR Bamboo from Evolve you've got a slow, medium, fast and then essentially a sport mode, which essentially makes the performance of the board a lot more aggressive and intense, but that has a big reflection on how much range you're able to get out of the board. So bear that in mind. So essentially, if you wanted to get more range out of the GTR Bamboo board, all you'd need to do is switch it into Pro mode. The top speed would still be exactly the same as the Ownboard, it's just the time frame it would take you to be able to get there. So the acceleration would be much, much more comparable to Ownboard's acceleration, but this would essentially result in you getting much more range. So if anything in this area, although I did say that it makes sense to award a point each to both of these board manufacturers in this case, when you actually compare the performance benefits of Pro mode versus the highest mode on the Ownboard, this is where they are very, very close in terms of the acceleration, the top speed, but the range with the Evolve board would be greater if switched into Pro mode and not GTR mode with that savage acceleration. So realistically, I think it's only right that we give a point to Evolve in this case. To round up this section with the range, we'll essentially give both of these boards a point each for the range, but because of the different remote options and modes that are available on each of these boards, we'll award an additional point to Evolve because, of course, if you switch it into Pro mode, you increase the benefits in terms of your range, but still keep the same top speed, but just increase the time frame, or essentially you're slowing down your acceleration or the aggressiveness of the acceleration to get you to top speed. So I think that's the best way to end on this particular category. Now, when we move on to the points about braking, this is again essentially one of the most important elements of an electric skateboard. Not necessarily the most important to me, but it's obviously a very important one because you want to be able to stop. Now, when we look at Ownboard, in the review and also first impressions, we touched on the fact that the braking is very, very soft on these boards. With or without the ESC updates, we've still seen exchanges with messages on different forums and posts and videos that the braking and acceleration still could use some touch-ups. So in this area, we have to keep long story short and just award a point to Evolve here, because anyone that knows anything about the GTR boards is that the acceleration is aggressive and the braking is incredibly responsive. What you find with Evolve boards, which is the opposite to what we've seen with the Ownboard, is the faster you're going with an Evolve board, the sharper the braking is. The slower you're going, the much more relaxed the braking is and soft. So essentially, that's the right way to have it, whereas with the Ownboard, you don't want to be going fast and have soft braking and have very aggressive braking when you're going slowly. I think it should be the other way around. But a point that I will mention is one thing I did really like on the Ownboard is that if you're just gently rolling down like a slope or something like that and you pull back on the brake, it will bring the board to pretty much a halt. Whereas the Evolve GTR Bamboo, that's not something that will happen. It's not something that is a massive deal because you can just put your foot on the ground. But if you didn't want to come off of the board at any point, it's definitely worth mentioning that. But I think in terms of safety and having responsive brakes, we have to give a point to Evolve in this area here. Now, when we touch on the ride of these two boards, of course you know where this conversation is going to go, because this is something that we've mentioned in the review of the Ownboard. If you're carving very aggressively, very savagely, it's very, very twitchy and the board can be very unpredictable. But I have mentioned on numerous occasions how I do really like how low that deck sits to the ground. It does minimize on your ground clearance, so if you're a bigger rider or riding over speed bumps or anything like that, you need to be cautious of that. But it was a very good ride, aside from the unpredictability nature of it. If you're riding much slowly, much more conservatively, you're not so confident with your carving, this would definitely be a great board. But in comparison to the GTR Bamboo, You can be as aggressive as you want to be with that board. It's after you've gotten used to the board, you know exactly how it's going to respond and react. So it's very, very difficult to not award a point here to the GTR. But of course, we have to bear in mind that the price on the GTR Bamboo is significantly higher than with the Ownboard. But this is essentially what you're paying for. Those little finer details that need to be refined in terms of the responsive braking, the intense acceleration, and of course, the very, very stable ride. These are all elements that are key and what you would expect when you pay Evolve money for an electric skateboard. This is one of those areas that's very, very difficult to kind of go into more detail about. It is what it is. The Ownboard is a great board, but you can't expect a board that almost costs 50% less than an Evolve GTR. From the surface, from the specs online, they can look very, very similar. But when you actually ride them, you see what the performance is like, you see what the feel is like. That's where you see the difference in terms of what you're spending on a board. That's where the difference is really, really felt. It's difficult to see this on a website, but when you get both of these boards out on the streets and you go for a ride, you can basically immediately see where your money goes. Now, when we move on to the deck, which of course is definitely an element of the ride, the deck on the Ownboard, in my opinion, I actually prefer the deck on the Ownboard versus the deck on the Bamboo GTR. But of course, that drop down, if you're a bigger, heavier rider, might not be ideal. If you need to go over a lot of different speed bumps, again, that might not be ideal. But in terms of not having to look down where my feet are on the board, because I can feel it because of that drop down shape of the deck, and also because you have a lower center of gravity, I feel like you can be a little bit more maneuverable with the board. So that style of deck definitely appeals to me. So in terms of which board has the better deck, I'm going to give it to Ownboard over here. So definitely Ownboard get a point because of the deck design. Quickly touching on the flexibility of these decks, the Bamboo GTR is a little bit more flexy than the Ownboard, but it's not by a very, very huge margin. It's definitely something that you feel when you're kind of going over the more severe bumps, and having inner tube tires versus having airless tires, again, is another area that you're really going to benefit from having that spongy deck. If Ownboard's deck was a little bit more spongy, maybe it would help to compensate for the wheels, but I'm definitely going to go ahead and say that the flexiness of the deck with the Ownboard was a little bit stiffer than it was on the GTR. So over here, I think it's only fair to award a point each because both of these decks are good, and it's really personal preference and also your build that dictates which deck might be the better one for you. So I'm going to give them a point each in terms of the deck. Now, looking at both of the remotes for these boards, they're both very, very different from each other. Evolve have a more trigger style remote with an LCD screen on the top, whereas of course Ownboard have a very traditional kind of like your standard Hobbywing remote. Depending on which one you get, it could have the OLED screen on it, or it might just be the one with the LED lights. But I will always opt for a remote that has a dead man switch over one that doesn't, because I just think personally all remotes should have dead man switches. I know it's not something that everyone likes, but that's definitely something that I'm a big fan of. I'm not going to comment too much in terms of the screens and what information is displayed on each of them, because like I said, I know that Ownboard do have a remote that comes with the OLED screen, and that's not the one that we have, so I don't want to go into too much detail about that. But the fact that there is an absence of a dead man switch on Ownboards, for my personal liking and what I prefer, I have to award the point to Evolve, because I'd prefer my remotes to all have dead man switches on them. Whether it's a scroll or a trigger, I prefer a dead man switch. Now on to charging. Now, as we know with the Ownboard, if you've seen our review, I'll link it down below if you haven't, the Ownboard does take a while to charge, somewhere around the 5-hour mark. Now, I did say it would be nice if these boards were shipped standard with the fast chargers. It's not something that they do currently. I'd strongly suggest that they do, but of course, this is reflected in the price that they pay. So it's difficult, again, to compare a board that takes 5 hours to charge versus a board that takes between 1.5 hours to 2 hours to charge. That's a very, very big difference. So of course, we need to award a point in this area to Evolve. Now, the second to last point I wanted to touch on is going to be the warranty. This is a really, really big deal when it comes to boards. A lot of boards online all claim to have warranties, whether it be 6 months, 12 months, but that means jack if the company isn't willing to actually honor the warranty that they put in place. We've had instances where people have reached out to us on Instagram and also on YouTube about horror stories with X-Ray warranties, with Vesta warranties, Wowgo warranties. This is the issue when you look at these boards from manufacturers and companies that are based in China. Now, this isn't me referencing where the boards are made, this is me referencing where the companies are based. It's a big deal when you have a board that you're spending £1,000+ on. You want to make sure that you have a warranty, so if anything goes wrong with it, it can be repaired, or parts can be sent to you without you having to pay for it. Aside from that, one of the most and biggest important elements of that is to make sure that the board can be repaired in the country that you live in. If you have to ship your board to another country for it to be repaired, or you have to troubleshoot somebody by sending an email and waiting a week for a response, maybe getting a part shipped out to you to find out that that doesn't resolve the issue, that doesn't work. For me, if I'm spending the £1,000 mark or more on a board, I want to know that there's somewhere in my country that I can get the board fixed And most importantly, I'd like to know that there's somebody that I can call to ask questions about the board, if I'm new to it, to ask if this is normal, to ask if this is something that I should be concerned about, or just to call up and say, hey, does my board need to get shipped to you? Having that direct line of contact, because some companies have service centers in multiple countries, is priceless. And if that's an element that's important to you, stop basing your decision on a good board by which one is the cheapest online. The cheapest isn't always the best, and that's not me, making fun or poking fun at Ownboard, because what they've created is a very, very good product. It is a solid board, but I'm always going to opt for domestic support over a cheaper price point and having to worry about what happens when the product eventually does go wrong. Because if you're riding the hell out of these boards, something will need servicing, something might need replacing. So in this area, because I know that Evolve have global service centers and they have one in the UK, I can call the guys in Duxford and ask them questions about my board. You can't do that with Ownboard, so we have to give a point to Evolve in this area. And second to that also comes into the actual period of purchasing the board. With Evolve, you buy the board, you decide after a day or two of having it, maybe this isn't for me. You can contact the guys and see if it's the type of thing that you can have returned, maybe pick up something else, maybe get your money back. That again is something that you can't do with Ownboard. You buy the board, that is you stuck with the board. So these elements again come into question when we're looking at why there is such a big difference in price. Now that leads us very nicely onto price itself. Aside from the actual components, the fact that you have UK servicing or global servicing if you're in Australia, if you're in America, if you're somewhere else in Europe, that is something that a lot of these other board manufacturers don't have. Now, when you have actual people that are in a service center exclusively in a separate country from where the board is based or made to service the board, to look after the customers, to deal with after sales, that is going to have an impact and a reflection on the price you pay for the board. So aside from the parts, the reliability, the name, the performance, the fact that you know that you're buying a product that is consistent, that is stable in comparison to some of the other options that are out there, all of these elements will have an impact on the price you pay for the board. Now, when you look at it from that perspective, that's the reason that the price can fluctuate so heavily between these two boards. Essentially, we have Ownboard sitting at somewhere around the £800 mark versus the Evolve GTR Bamboo with the all-terrain wheels sitting around the £1,400 mark. So you can see why the price is so different. So this isn't an area where I can essentially award a point. This is where your opinion needs to come into fact. Look at the points, look at the different benefits versus the cons or pros or disadvantages, and figure out which one is the one that makes the most sense for yourself. Now, I'm going to say that if you're a new rider, you're just trying to kind of get to grips with the whole electric skateboard thing, you just want a board that's going to get you across the city, you don't really want too much out of it, and the whole thing about warranty and servicing doesn't kind of like bug you, the whole after sales thing doesn't worry you or disturb you, Ownboard is going to be a great board for you to go for. But if you're a rider that has maybe a bit of experience, or you're a rider that maybe this is your first board, but you think this electric skateboarding thing is going to be something that you're going to stick to, and you've kind of been bit by the bug, and you know this is just the beginning of your kind of adventure in this whole world, then again, that's where the Evolve probably makes the most sense, because it's a product that you know that you can have a little bit more confidence with because of the chain of support and after sales services that you get that we've all covered in this video previously. So that's where it comes down to. It's a very difficult one, but if you're looking to carve hard, ride hard, you've been bit by the electric skateboarding bug and you're going to be doing this for a while, maybe the Evolve is the one you need to consider. But if you're quite new, still trying to find your feet, you're not sure if this is something you're going to stick to, not worried about after sales or servicing or warranties, maybe the Ownboard is something that you need to consider. But we have to say that the price of the Ownboard and the board that you get, I can't complain. It is a solid board. But just bear the points in mind that I've covered in the video, figure out which one works for you, process of elimination through this vast list of things that I've covered, and that will give you the answer of which one you need to go for. But if you want, all of the links to pick up either one of these boards will be down below in the video description. A big thank you for watching. If you've got any questions or you feel there's anything I've left out, comment down below and I'll try and answer it in as much detail as I can. Thumbs up the video if this was helpful, subscribe so you can stay up to date with all of the videos that we post, and I'll catch you in the next one. That was a mouthful. But thank you for watching all the way to the end, and take care till next time. Thumbs up and subscribe, and take care.